Well, hey everyone, we want to welcome you back to another installment of our video devotions. If you've been working through this study with us, we're making our way through the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a fascinating book. It's a book, it's actually a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome. And the Christians in Rome were living in, hostile territory. There was incredible persecution against the church that broke out in the first century, and Rome was kind of the hotbed for all of that persecution against the church. And so the believers had a difficult time living out their faith there without fearing their life or repercussions or consequences because of their faith. And so in chapter 13, where we're going to be at today, I would just encourage you to read the chapter on your own. We don't have time in these video devotions to go through every verse of the chapter. And actually, the first half of the chapter is really fascinating in what it deals with. And Paul talks about the relationship between believers and government, and the relationship between believers and maybe a government that's not believers or not Christian-based or not faith-based, and how do we deal with that, and should we pay our taxes, and how do we deal with conflict and all of that kind of stuff, and should there be a respect toward those people in authority even when they don't hold the same positions in their belief system as we do as believers. So there's a lot of stuff there, and if you've never read Romans 13 verses 1 through 7, I would just encourage you to do that and really kind of reflect on that and ask yourself, how are you living as a believer under maybe a government that maybe does not see the Bible or the worldview like you do. But Paul gets into this section today that I want to highlight, and he starts in verse 8 with a really interesting verse, and it was applicable to them in the first century. It's also applicable to us today. In verse 8, Paul writes and he says, "Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law." Paul uses that phrase, it's the continuing debt of love that we have toward others. Now, debt indicates that we owe something. Debt indicates that we have some kind of payment to make to someone to make amends for something. Now, we know that Jesus was sent by God. Because of God's love, he sent Jesus to die for us. And there's been some people that would speculate this is our way of paying back God by loving other people. But the reality is we can never pay back God. We will never be able to earn our way back into good standings with God. That was the whole purpose of Jesus coming. So this debt that we have toward other people signifies this obligation that we have to be like Jesus. That Jesus came to bless us, that Jesus came to love us, that we're called then to be ambassadors for Jesus, and that continuing debt to love one another is lived out in our life. When Paul says that it's a continuing debt of love, it means it's ongoing. It doesn't go away. This debt, this obligation, this responsibility that we have to love other people, regardless of who they are and their position in life, is something that will never run out. Until Jesus comes back again, or until we're called home, we are called to love other people. And Paul says that when we love people genuinely like this, we fulfill the law. And it's interesting because then Paul goes back and he begins to allude to some Old Testament scriptures. And in the Old Testament, we understand God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. And he says this in verse 9. He says, "The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command, to love your neighbor as yourself." And I love that concept. And Paul says, listen, Paul identifies kind of the last half of the 10 commands there, to not murder, not commit adultery, to not steal, to not covet, and those different things. And obviously we need to work toward not breaking them. And so if we're not going to break those, Paul gives us kind of a recipe here of how to live underneath those laws, how to live and exercise those laws in our life. And he says the way you do that is you love your neighbor as yourself. Do you genuinely love your neighbor? And what happens is that when you and I can love our neighbor, or love the people around us, or love our coworkers, or our classmates, or our friends, when we can love them genuinely, When we can love them the way Christ loved us, we won't be tempted to commit adultery. We won't be tempted to murder. We won't be tempted to steal or to covet or to have jealousy toward those people. And it's really amazing how congruent Paul's words here in Romans 13 are with Jesus' words. When Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God. But Jesus also said the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so those two things are synonymous there. They kind of dovetail together, that Paul says, listen, if we want to live the right life, if we want to live a life that is standing up under the law, the responsibilities that we have as believers, the main prerequisite to all that is that we love one another. And so I would just encourage you to ask yourself this week, in what tangible ways are you really loving those people that God has placed around you, your neighbors? And I'm not talking about your specific neighbors on either side of your home, but just those people that you do life with. Those are our neighbors. How are you tangibly loving those people and fulfilling the law of God? And following this video, there's some discussion questions. Love to have you chime in on those and maybe discuss those with a friend, or maybe do a Bible study with your family at your house. And pray that God will bless you and enrich you as you dive into His Word together. God bless.